Hello everyone, LaFinchy here. Today, we will be discussing a timeline where America fails to centralize as a state and collapses shortly after its independence. In our timeline, from its Declaration of Independence in 1776 to the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, America existed as a confederation between the different colonies, where central authority was generally weak and led to greater power within state governments. This proved to be a threat to the survival of the USA, as disputes over how the government should be structured and territorial disputes threatened the structural integrity of the new nation. Despite this, the United States overcame these disputes and, with the ratification of the Constitution, adopted a more central government that led to America becoming the global power we know today. In this timeline, interstate and governmental disputes boil over, leading to the collapse of the United States into 13 separate republics in the 1780s, thus eliminating the US from world history. Right off the bat, this would likely slow down or even halt American settlement into the Midwest, as Britain would be more likely to enforce their ban on Transappalachian settlement, with the exception of Ohio, which could declare independence as a settler republic. At best, there would be sizable Anglo-American settler communities across the continent, especially in Mexico and Louisiana. Without the United States, we could see the official establishment of Tecumseh's Confederacy, or Indiana, as a protectorate of the British Empire. With the propagation of a Native American state against European settlers, it could lead to a Pan-Indian political movement gaining momentum, as Indiana could support and defend initiatives for First Nations sovereignty and liberation with the rise of nationalism, which could lead to the preservation of native nations in places like the Deep South and the Plains. The Vermont Republic, having planned to join the United States as soon as their sovereignty from New York was recognized, would likely go through with the Haldimand negotiations and return under British control, eventually being admitted into Canada. However, it is possible that without the United States, a Vermonter national identity based around their resistance to New York and the Royalist forces could emerge, thus sustaining an independent Vermont. I can see Vermont gradually developing a joint Anglo-French identity, as proximity to Quebec could enlarge Vermont's francophone population. Due to the proximity and lack of size of the colonies in this area, New England would be the most vulnerable to annexation by the British Empire, possibly looking to reclaim one of their most valuable territories. This could pressure the states of New England to unite into a sort of commonwealth for defense. However, since such a state would likely be dominated by Massachusetts, states like New Hampshire may have reservations around such an arrangement, and opt for an alliance. Massachusetts alone also likely wouldn't be able to defend their claims over the Aroostook region, leading to much of northern Maine coming under the jurisdiction of New Brunswick. Down in the mid-Atlantic region, the states of New York and Pennsylvania would develop a fierce rivalry over hegemony over Middle Anglo-America. New Jersey, caught in the middle of this feud, is likely to come under the influence or downright annexation of either nation, as an attempt to strengthen the commercial power of New York City and Philadelphia respectively. Pennsylvania may also attempt to expand their influence into the Chesapeake region by swaying Maryland or Delaware. In this map, I predict that Pennsylvania defeats New York for a massive coalition including New Jersey, Vermont, and southern New England, with Pennsylvania annexing much of upstate New York City going to a Pennsylvania-aligned New Jersey, and some minor concessions to New English states, leaving the Dutch-controlled puppet state of Van Buren Land around the Hudson River and Catskills. Some of the upstate could be allocated to an autonomous Haudenosaunee entity in exchange for their contribution of the Iroquois against New York. However, this outcome is rather unlikely due to Pennsylvania's nature as a settler colony. Demographically, German immigration to Pennsylvania would continuously accelerate during the 19th century, congregating around the Dutch country and Allegheny regions. For this, I can see Pennsylvania drifting away from their original British identity in favor of a Pennsylvania Dutch identity that would proliferate most regions, apart from Philadelphia, especially as a Pennsylvania Dutch ruling elite would coalesce in Harrisburg. After the partition of New York, Dutch would also likely be propped up further by the Pennsylvania-influenced government. The Deep South would be more contentious politically between Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Virginia, having the largest demographic and economic base out of the southern states, could expand into the Carolinas as shown on the map, where a joint invasion and partition of North Carolina, making South Carolina the second most powerful in the region. Virginia could also challenge Pennsylvania over influence on the Chesapeake region. Of course, without the Civil War, the southern states would preserve the institution of slavery into the 19th and even 20th centuries, as the South would continue to rely on the cash crop export economy. But as industrial production outperforms the plantation system along with international condemnation, the southern states would eventually have to abolish slavery, but not without some residual institutionalized discrimination against African Americans. Moving west, without the concerted effort of the United States into expansion, the southern states would have a harder time eating into Amerindian territory, especially as nations like Indiana and the United Kingdom would have a vested interest in funding the Native American states against the weakest settler colonies. In this timeline, the Trail of Tears never happens, and the Deep South would be largely dominated by the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, with other nations like the Yuchi existing as ethnic minorities. Large Afro-Amerindian communities would also exist in all these countries, as plantation slavery would become more adopted with the emerging native planter class. Chattel slavery would likely be abolished at the same time as the Anglo-American southern states. Florida would remain under Spanish rule without the Americans, mainly as a plantation colony. Its relatively small population would likely remain under Spanish rule during the Latin American revolutions of the early 19th century, like Cuba and Puerto Rico. If they even occur, as without the success of the USA, the French Revolution may occur in a different manner and thus affect Spain's relationship to its American colonies. Either way, Florida would develop a relatively small but diverse population based in San Agustin. The Seminole would be the predominant indigenous nation in Spanish Florida, and could lead an independence movement in Florida in the late 19th century, along with the Floridian mestizo population, sparking a revolution quite similar to Cuba or the Philippines. With the chaos of the Latin American independence wars, I can also see the Choctaw and Creek nations invading western Florida, including Pensacola, in an effort to secure traditional lands of Muskegon nations like the Appalachee, weakening Spain's hold over the Americas. At the time of Revolution, Louisiana was a Spanish possession that still held a large French Creole population. Without the Louisiana Purchase by the Jefferson administration, Louisiana's fate would be quite precarious. Assuming the Napoleonic Wars still happened, despite the changes in the underwhelming result of the American Revolution and the outbreak of the French Revolution, The Treaty of San Ildefonso would still occur, exchanging Louisiana back to France. Like in our timeline, Napoleon would likely have very little confidence in the security of the colony, not investing too much resources into Louisiana's development. Due to minimal control from France, I can see a Creole-run Louisiana potentially revolting and leaving around the Congress of Vienna as the Mississippi Confederation, taking inspiration mainly on the ideals of the First French Republic. Louisiana's population would grow slowly due to its low population, with French, Creole, and German Dutch immigrants settling around Saint Louis and along the Mississippi River. However, the interior of Louisiana would likely remain under nominal Native American rule, which could lead to a greater autonomy for people like the Dakota, Catawba, and Pawnee, especially as Pan-Indianism for Indianism intelligentsia would strengthen calls for self-determination among First Nations people in Louisiana, possibly leading to the proliferation of more Amerindian countries for Louisiana's interior. The most powerful nation in the Americas, other than Britain, would definitely be Mexico. Without the Mexican-American War, its control over much of Western America, notably California and Texas, would have remained. This would have also made Mexico a more stable country without US interference within the Mexican state. This would have allowed Mexico to invest more effectively in their economy and thus would make Mexico an economic powerhouse in the Americas on par with Europe. This could motivate Mexico to expand their political and cultural influence across Latin America, such as in Central America, the Caribbean, and Florida, along with neighboring Louisiana. Certain Latin American countries, such as Colombia, Haiti, and Honduras, would definitely be better off economically without the United States interfering in their governments. This could make the Latin American world a stronger economic and cultural bloc, with Mexico and Brazil being regarded as major world powers. However, without the Monroe Doctrine, there is a possibility that smaller Latin and Anglo-American countries could fall under the influence of European colonial empires as more so indirect protectorates, making America a secondary theater of European imperialism for empires like Britain, France, or Germany. Without as much Yankee migration into Texas and US support, the Texan Revolution would fail and the Anglo-Texan nationalist movement would be quashed. In order to curtail the influence of American settlers, Mexico might encourage the migration of Catholic Germans through the Altersverein organization as more loyal settlers to the Mexican government, as well as settlers from Mexico proper. This could lead to Texas developing a stronger German character, as Catholic Germans would prefer it over the Protestant-dominated Pennsylvania. Immigration would be further stoked with the discovery of oil, making Texas more important economically to Mexico. Other Catholic European peoples like Poles, Czechs, Slovenes, and Hungarians would also begin emigrating to Texas. California would be an extremely valuable asset to Mexico, especially as the gold rush would drive economic activity to the region, and cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco would be used as entrepôts for Pacific trade. Mexican settlers would be the main demographic to migrate during the gold rush. Like in our timeline, Asian immigration to California would be immense, with thousands of Chinese and Filipino immigrants coming in for mining jobs. The north of California is likely to receive a substantial amount of British immigration from Canada as well. The prevention of the United States would also have a large impact on the proliferation of the Mormon faith, as it would limit the options of where the Mormons could migrate to upon facing backlash in western New York. My best guess would be somewhere within southern Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Appalachian Virginia, only existing as an obscure religious community, if they even survive into modernity. In this timeline, Utah would be way less populated and predominantly Amerindian outside of the Salt Lake region. The areas of Northern California, the Great Basin, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and western Texas would also retain substantial Amerindian populations. Canada in this timeline would play a much more prominent role within North American geopolitics, with the Oregon Territory firmly under their control, along with likely additions such as Vermont, Massachusetts, at least Maine, and possibly Indiana. Canada would become the main recipient of British settlers and thus have a higher population. This could create internal tension with Lower Canada, Quebec, which may perceive the political power of French Canadians threatened. This may see a successful referendum in the 20th century for the secession of Quebec. Canada and Indiana would be likely to feud over the ownership of native lands in what is now Northern Ontario, especially those of the Ojibwe people. However, Britain would be more likely to back the interests of the Canadian settlers over the Amerindian Indiana. Since the purchase of Alaska in 1867 would be prevented, Russia would likely be stuck with the seemingly burdensome colony, with Russian and Ukrainian settlers continuing to develop the colony, and eventually exploit resources such as oil that would make it a more valuable asset to the empire. Given World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution still occur, Alaska could turn into an exiled white movement government under the protection of Canada, likely recognizing it as a legitimate Russian government as opposed to the USSR. To conclude, the failure of America to draft a constitution and the collapse of the state would have profound impacts on not only North America but the entire world in general, with the prevention of a modern world power. North America would become a more politically and culturally diverse continent. Here is the final product.